So we might begin. My name is Ross. I'll be conducting the sessions today. I'd like to welcome everyone here to Tara Institute. It's a relaxed and informal environment, so feel free just to simply be. And it's also going to be, in many important ways, provocative today, because the topic demands a radical realignment of our habitual thought. So we're going to be going into quite a lot of detail about how and why that might be. What's the purpose of examining our habitual thought and trying to attempt to bring about some transformation? So these are all very, very valid and very poignant questions, and they go to the heart of the topic, thought transformation. So we can also discuss that term a little bit more as we go. I've decided to throw us in the deep end, because without understanding some of the basic terms and sort of expressions connected to this topic, it's very difficult to wrap our minds around it. So one of my university lecturers, Elizabeth Gross, who was for some of us might know, a feminist theorist, she used to get into a terrible lot of trouble at uni because she would quote Freud and Marx and a number of male theorists, much to the upset of her more radical feminist students. And when she was challenged, she said, well, to put it frankly, if you had a brain tumour and I was a surgeon and you wanted me to operate on you, you'd rather I knew the names and the parts of your brain before I proceeded with the surgery. In the same way, if I'm going to critique or examine a body of thought, I need to enter into that body of thought in a very, very precise and detailed manner and learn the vocabulary of that system. And so she was always committed to reading from within Freud and then working out what we do with Freud based on her reading. So there's a great value in thinking that way for us as well. So in other words, don't feel alienated by any of the terms. See them as a challenge to maybe gain a new hook to gather important and valuable concepts. Another issue that faces us here as so-called Buddhists in a non-traditional Buddhist culture, rich as it is that we don't have equivalent terms in English, for example, for some of these notions. And so for that reason, using the traditional terms becomes a form of shorthand that's very, very effective in conveying a body of thought in one instant. So again, if we translate too much, if we try to somehow assimilate too much, we're in danger of losing something precious about the system. So that's anyway a little bit of background. We're also going to be engaging in meditation, and particularly what we call analytical meditation. And for some of us this might come as a surprise that this is even considered a meditational activity. So analytical meditation is when we take a very clear, focused state of mind and use it to probe, sift, evaluate, analyse and resolve new ways of approaching situations. And so in some ways it's akin to a therapeutic process within a Western psychotherapeutic framework, because we're trying to ascertain our compulsions, our attitudes and so forth, trying to see how they manifest, how they operate, how we avoid resolving them, etc., and then through very, very brave and direct approach, go right into the heart of those issues and see if we can somehow rework them, redo them, do things differently, live differently, respond differently. These are very incredibly potent and important things to consider. And so analytical meditation is a way of kind of swinging things around. So there's a beautiful Buddhist expression that in order to transform my attitudes, I don't have to somehow transform them all at once, because that's impossible. I only need to work on one particular aspect at a time. And so the analogy in Buddhism is you push the corner of the table and the table turns. It's actually a very beautiful image. In analytical meditation, by probing in incredible precision and clarity one particular point, often one connected to prejudice, projection and so forth, we have the capacity to shift, even if it's imperceptible at the time, an entire framework of our operation in life, our approach to life, who we think we are, what we're capable of, etc. So not to underestimate the effectiveness of analytical meditation, but also not to be surprised at how specific it is in its direction to investigate particular points. So don't for a moment think I'm being pedantic as I sort of niggle in to examining something over and over and over from a number of different viewpoints, because this is really part and parcel of the effectiveness of the technique. So that's a very, very valuable thing to take away from this weekend, because analytical meditation is something we do in our daily lives, not just something we do here together in this room. So you're learning a skill that can be carried along with a form of meditation based on single-pointedness, which is to bring calmness to the mind. So we need to have a union of those two. So we're going to begin today with a meditation that's going to start with a single-pointed focus in order to bring a state of calmness and relaxation to the mind. And then we're going to flow into our first analytical meditation, which is going to have a series of steps. So it's a journey. And this particular meditation is an absolutely classic meditation. So I've chosen to give it in its classical form in order to gain some sense of the scale of what we're looking at today. We're talking about transforming attitudes, but how big is that transformation? How much should we aim for? What are we actually capable of? So this meditation is throwing all those doors wide open and creating a vast vista of potential that we might not even have considered before. So with that, we'll consolidate our spots. And what I mean by that is we acknowledge that we're on a spot. And I'd have to say that we're on an indigenous spot at the moment, just being aware of how we come to be in this particular place, and to pay respect to the indigenous elders of this place. Become aware of our spot, sitting here. Becoming aware of our bodies. Becoming aware of our mind. What mental states are flowing or arising. Now for a few in and out breaths, we visualize that all of our physical and mental unrest leaves the body with the out breath, and with the in breath, a relaxed body and a relaxed open mind arise. So, for example, if we're anxious, anxious leaves with the out breath, and a state of calm mind enters with the in breath. So just work with our own situation for a few moments. Now we rest our awareness upon the breath itself, merely observing the breath as it flows at every point of its flow. So we're aware of an in-breath, beginning, middle and end of an in-breath, the beginning, middle and end of an out-breath, the beginning, middle and end of the space between. So just as the breath flows, our awareness of the breath gently rides upon it, as might a feather in the wind, not losing contact. Wherever the breath goes, our awareness of the breath goes. They touch. If thoughts or distractions appear, simply acknowledge them and put them aside with no fuss and return to awareness of the breath. So we're not controlling the breath, we're merely observing. If the mind's becoming heavy or sludgy, this is a sign that we're not paying sufficient attention to our object, the breath. So we need to hold it a little more firmly, more precisely, more vividly. Just make that little bit more effort to be aware of the breath. Or if, on the other hand, we're overexcited or becoming aware that we're already excited, too many thoughts rushing here and there, Just let these subside by gently resting upon the breath with awareness. Just letting go of these distractions. Just checking, are we aware of the breath? Checking. We're now going to move into the second phase of the meditation, the analytical component. And this is also going to function as a means of generating our motivation, not just for the meditation, but for the day ahead. And this motivation goes to the very heart of our topic. So Pabonka Rinpoche said that if we lack the awakening mind of enlightenment, even if we spend an entire lifetime meditating on an empty mountain, any meditations we do will be merely perfunctory and will not get a whit closer to Buddhahood. So this aspiration to become enlightened for the benefit of others is crucial. So one of the classic means of generating this mind is the technique of exchanging self and others. So I'm going to quietly lead us through the steps. And as I do so, the invitation from our side is to explore the ideas that are being raised. So, for example, if we're going to aspire to become enlightened for the benefit of all other beings, foundational to this notion is the requirement of having an unbiased attitude. So this idea of an unbiased attitude can be considered in three ways: from the side of others, from the side of ourselves, and from an ultimate viewpoint. So in the text, Offering to the Spiritual Master, a verse reads, "There is no difference between ourselves and others. No one wishes even the slightest suffering, or is ever content with the happiness she has. Realizing this, we seek your blessings that we may enhance the bliss and joy of others." So consider how oneself and all other sentient beings are completely the same in desiring happiness and not desiring suffering. Completely the same. So we can start with those closest to us, i.e. ourselves, our relatives, friends, and expand outwards. Is this true? We can include animals, all other beings, not just humans. If this is true as a reason, then it's worthless to hate someone and to be attached to someone else. If we're all exactly the same in wishing happiness and not to suffer, how can we justify a partisan attitude, in other words, only concern for the happiness of some, even to the exclusion of concern for others? So now we might think that some people or some beings have found happiness while others haven't. So this could be the basis of a partisan attitude. But if you look more deeply, we recognize that although all beings wish to be happy, they lack happiness. We're talking here about a stable, profound happiness, not just an ephemeral, momentary enjoyment or pleasure. This kind of deeper happiness is elusive. Even a worm, as it struggles across a hot pavement, is searching for relief, searching for happiness in its every movement. Just as we do. And although beings wish not to be oppressed by suffering, suffering appears in so many forms, often unexpected. A sudden diagnosis of cancer, for example. So again, we have no basis of a partisan attitude based on who is oppressed by suffering and who isn't. If 10 people were struggling with a very virulent illness, it would be inappropriate to only care for 1 or 2 of the 10. We would care for all equally. So we extrapolate this outwards. At this point, the self-regarding mind tends to kick in with thoughts like, well, yes, that's all very well, but some beings actively hurt me or harm me or hinder my happiness in very deliberate or even structural ways. Therefore, it is appropriate that I have a biased attitude. So just identify whether this is active in our own lives. Certainly the case in the life of global politics at the moment with the Kurdish situation, what that represents in terms of a regard for equally for the happiness of all beings and their rights to happiness. This is just an example, isn't it? So does this happen on a microcosmic scale within our own lives, our own setting? Even if it's the rejection of a brother or a sister due to an argument, or a child through a disagreement. So from a Buddhist perspective, a deep perspective, even if someone is harming us, it's true that in the past lifetimes they have helped us over and over. Just as even if they've hurt us in one day of our lives, it's not necessarily the case that they hurt us all the time. So why do we exaggerate, consolidate this idea that the ones who hurt are not to be considered precious and worthy of our care and regard? So, from past lifetimes until now, sentient beings have been of benefit to us innumerable times, and so again they will in the future. So try to get this much broader view. This being so, we should practice viewing them equally from the point of our own welfare and benefit. Now we might come up with another objection, that of so-called total strangers, those who we deem to have neither helped nor harmed us. Why should we have equal respect to these beings? This might be an unconscious attitude. How aware are we of the actual situation of a stranger? Do we even bother or care to know? What's at stake in rendering the stranger strange? What does it take to maintain them in that category? What investment, emotional and otherwise, is involved? So if it's true that we don't need to consider the well-being of a stranger because we're indifferent to them, then even our compassion towards an animal about to be slaughtered would make no sense. Because it would be an object of complete indifference. This animal has neither helped nor harmed us. However, it is necessary to have compassion towards it. So the analysis here involves recognizing compassion and its force, which is to be concerned for the welfare of others, irrespective of whether we see them as friend, enemy, or stranger. This is a very profound thought. Compassion in this sense is unconditional. It doesn't require knowledge of the actual state of the other person. There is already compassion focused there. Another way of contemplating at this point is to consider that the three categories of friend, enemy and stranger are ruled by impermanence. There is nothing stable in these three categories. Our dearest friend of kindergarten is a total stranger today. A total stranger yesterday becomes a new friend tomorrow. A friend after a bitter altercation becomes an enemy and perhaps a stranger. These three categories are in constant, mutable flow. Likewise, we, the meditator, are circulating in the minds of others as either friend, enemy and stranger. This can be changing in their minds from moment to moment. Someone might regard us as a dear friend and tomorrow disregard us as a friend at all. So this leads to the third contemplation from the ultimate perspective. Buddhas regard all beings as pure by nature. All beings have an equal potential to become fully enlightened. Due to this, there's no basis of discrimination. So, if there's something to blame or begrudge, from a Buddhist perspective, we blame the delusion and not the person. We identify what's holding people back from becoming enlightened, rather than somehow committing the person to failure or despair. I.e., they can't become enlightened. That one can't become enlightened. Just me and a few other select beings are privileged to become enlightened. Sorry about your situation. This kind of logic has no place from an ultimate perspective, because we all have an absolutely equal capacity to become fully enlightened, even down to the smallest insect. So now we move on to the next major step of the meditation, which is to recognize the faults of the self-cherishing attitude. This is one of those expressions that I was referring to earlier, self-cherishing attitude. This is the mind that thinks, mine, mine, mine. Me, me, me. It prioritizes compulsively our own needs and wishes over those of others, even at their expense. So if we analyse very deeply, we can identify this self-cherishing attitude as the source of all our problems. This self-cherishing attitude is like a chronic disease. It's difficult to identify and difficult to root out. So part of our challenge as meditators is to begin to discern the operation of our own self-cherishing. So here we distinguish between a legitimate concern for our own happiness, remembering that just as like everyone else we wish to be happy and not to suffer in every moment. This kind of wish, acknowledging this wish, is perfectly legitimate. But the self-cherishing attitude is something more than that. It's exaggerating, distorting, prioritizing me over others. This attitude bothers us. Creates the conditions that can precipitate in all sorts of problematic states of mind, such as anger, jealousy, pride, hatred, etc. Even at seemingly a moment's notice, a powerful self-cherishing attitude can rise up, even in relation to the smallest stimulus. Perhaps someone took away our headphones and didn't return them. Next thing, we're having a full-scale battle with our friend. So the next phase of the meditation is to recognize the benefits of cherishing others. So I quote here from the Panchen Lama, "The mind that cherishes all mother beings and would secure them in bliss is the gateway leading to infinite virtues. Seeking this, we seek your blessings to cherish these beings more than our lives, even should they rise up as our enemies." So His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that whether we believe in reincarnation or not doesn't matter. Whether we believe in karma or not doesn't matter. But holding others dear brings peace to the mind. Ultimately, it leads to purifying all distorted states of mind, overcoming all obstacles. So if we have an attitude of cherishing others more than ourselves, even if we don't aim to have high rebirths and come closer to enlightenment, this will arise spontaneously. In other words, we don't need to struggle to fulfill our own needs if we cherish others. So, the conclusion is cherishing others is the supreme virtuous attitude. Every goodness in the world comes from cherishing others. Compare this to world leaders who do not have this thought. Thus, the difference between the spiritually immature and the enlightened is determined by whether or not cherishing others is present. So now we just make our own resolve over the course of the day, which will go very swiftly. Might we explore this idea of self-cherishing and how it might be transformed dynamically into its exact opposite, cherishing others. So just spend a few moments in quiet contemplation. Now we can become gently aware of the breath. Aware of our bodies, aware of our location in the room. And we conclude the meditation. So that these steps in the meditation aren't meant to be polemical. They're not sort of trying to drive us into adopting a position in order to somehow adopt the correct position or the right position from a Buddhist perspective. As the Dalai Lama says, whether or not we're calling ourselves believers in reincarnation or karma, or for that matter Buddhists, doesn't matter whatsoever. The true estimation of our quality of being is our relationship, the quality of our relationship to others. This is the most profound idea. And so You might remember with the Panchen Lama quote, I referred to the mind, that Panchen Lama says, the mind that cherishes all mother beings and would secure them in bliss is a gateway leading to infinite virtue. This idea of all mother sentient beings is very, very special, because Buddhism starts from a position of trying to work from where we are, and in order to gain a model for this kind of care for others, even at the cost of care for ourselves in a sort of very narrow, tight sense, we take the example of a mother's love. And the role of a mother's love, I don't need to tell you how important that is, but it's kind of in a patriarchal sort of structure, kind of deliberately buried or abstracted out. I remember reading, anyone read Luce Irigaray, the French psychoanalytic theorist? She's a very interesting writer. She says, I'm just sort of mentioning this in a provocative way, I'm quite capable of being provocative. She says, why are we calling on God, this male god of the air, to come down to give us what we need? Why aren't we paying respects to the mother's womb that gave us birth? Why aren't we paying homage to the mother? I was reading Ocean Vuong's autobiographic novel while I was sick recently. I don't know if anyone else has read it. He's winning a few awards and things. He's a Vietnamese poet in America who wrote a very beautiful book to his Vietnamese immigrant mum who can't read or write, and he's written what is effectively a 120-page love letter to his mother who can't read it. So it's already profoundly poetic. But in one of the lines he says, the most precious part of my body is the part upon which my mother's shadow falls. What a beautiful thought that is. What is it to think, or how can we begin to think what it means for the body to be under the shadow of a mother's watchful gaze? And so my conclusion to that idea was every bit of our body falls under the mother's shadow. The most precious moment for a mother is any reflection of her child. Even if it's a difficult aspect in that child. You think of kids who go astray and they end up in prison. Who is it who visits them with lunch in a little tiny thing? It's their mum. I remember a few sad years ago with the Singaporean boy who was condemned to death in Singapore. Remember that he was doing a drug run for his brother in Melbourne, and he was caught, and he became the fall guy for his brother. And he protected his brother, by the way, throughout this whole episode. He never betrayed his love for his brother, even though he was going to die for it. His mother stood outside the prison gates looking at the clock ticking down to 12 o'clock, knowing that in that instant her boy was going to be killed. How extraordinary is that? So that's the shadow of the mother falling on her boy. So I have to argue then that that shadow is ubiquitous. It's spread entirely over that boy's life. Her concern is everywhere felt. So this is taken as a model. The mother's love is taken as a model in Buddhism to expand outwards, to embrace not all other beings like. We care for others as though they are our mother because we wish to repay our mother's kindness. But from a Buddhist perspective, we take another daring step. We actually see them as our mothers. Because you might be my mother in this lifetime, I might be your mother in your next lifetime. That permutation and combination idea that I mentioned in relation to friend, enemy and stranger is also playing out at that level as well. So even again, if we look at this just poetically, it is a very, very beautiful, I think, and ethically powerful notion. Yeah. So we're coming up for our first break already. We have a half-hour tea break and coffee break, and so we have a diner out there. And we do I haven't got mine yet, but we do have name tags. I should have one. It's important to have your name tag because it introduces you to each other. And one of the important things today is to spend some time talking and sharing ideas. So let's have our break and be back in here at 10:30.